Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Archival Discourses. This evening, we carry on last week's topic of the Zionist worldview. I'm once again very lucky to be joined by Hunger, the Merry Merchant, not the Dime Merchant. How are you?
I'm in the Christmas spirit, of course. That's why the hat must come on.
Indeed. And once again, we're also joined by American Elitist.
Wonderful, happy to be here. I don't have my Christmas hat, unfortunately, but it's there in spirit.
Cringe.
It's there.
No,
The
it's
Santa
all
hat
right.
must come on.
Indeed.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so last week we were reading through a very lengthy article by a certain King Crocoduck, self-proclaimed Giga Zionist, where he was critiquing a lot of the scholarly work done by Darrell Cooper, Martin Maid on the war in Israel-Palestine. Because it's so long, we only got through like 2 points that Crocoduck was critiquing, so today we're going to endeavour to try and get through the rest of the article. So if you're interested, there's part 1 on the channel, but we're going to pick up from point 3. So I'm just going to bring this article up.
Even if it kills us.
Oh, I'm sure that won't happen. But there we go. So he's critiquing assumption 3: the Palestinian people were already here. One of the more jarring junctures where the wineskin splits is at the subject of Palestinian national identity. Cooper assures us in the first episode that Zionists came in with the presumptuous colonial assumption that the Palestinian Arabs were ethnically undifferentiated from the other Arabs, and he suggests that this assumption was wrong. But strangely, when he later delves into the differences between the social dynamics of tribal societies and societies with strong state institutions, he lends support to the claim that the Palestinian national identity did not exist until after the Zionists arrived. Indeed, he talks at length about their national aspirations to join Greater Syria as well, as the notable Nashashibi's clan's attempts to absorb the region into Jordanian territory. Other Arabs held a vote in 1920, the outcome of which reflected the widely held view that Palestinian Arabs should be absorbed into Syria. You don't have a Palestinian national identity if you're trying to get absorbed into Jordan. You don't have a Palestinian national identity if you're trying to get absorbed into Syria. Something about the story isn't adding up, and even though some people, particularly those engaged in organising insurgencies against both Jews and Brits, may have been thinking along the lines of Palestinian national identity, there's no good reason to believe that such views were widespread among the Arabs. Cooper seems to oscillate between critiquing Zionist assumptions and agreeing with them. He wants to condemn them for failing to acknowledge the national characteristics of the people they're ostensibly colonizing, yet also wants to explore the sociological dynamics of the pre-national identity of these people when explaining their failure to develop state institutions during the Mandate period, one essential area where the Jews were successful. Cooper's storytelling, vivid and immersive, bursts open when confronted with the contradictory realities of Palestinian national identity. By trying to contain this complex, evolving identity within the rigid framework of Palestinian historiography, which exists upon a colonial relation between Zionists and Arabs, the narrative structure collapses under the pressure of its own contradictions. So here we go. Thus far, essentially, what Crocoduck is saying is, the Palestine national identity is fake because it's a modern construction. Well, I think that you're not seeing the wood through the trees if that's your argument, because people have been speaking the language and embracing that culture in that region for centuries. And so just because they call it Palestinian nationalism now doesn't mean that they never had a cultural identity which they still cling to. What your guys' thoughts?
No, I completely agree. And the problem with this argument is it's a half truth. In the sense that, like, yes, the people in the people west of the Jordan River did not they did not identify as Palestinian. That was a name that coalesced. First of all, it was a name that just described the region. The region was called Palestine because the differences between for example, like the Lebanese, the Syrians, and the Palestinians was very, how do I say it? There wasn't a very big distinction because there were no national borders between them at that time because it was all one Ottoman Empire. And then when we have the mandates, then they get broken up, and you start to have national borders that define them separately. So he's not wrong, but he's lying by omission, because the actual ethnicities of the people and he starts by saying, can you scroll up a little bit when he mentions Syria? I just want to read that passage one more time.
Okay, indeed, he talks at length about their national aspirations to join Greater Syria, as well as the notable Nashashibis clan's attempts to absorb the region into Jordanian territory. Other Arabs held a vote in 1920, the outcome of which reflected the widely held view that Palestinian Arabs should be absorbed into Syria. You don't have a Palestinian national identity if you're trying to get absorbed into Jordan. You don't have a Palestinian national identity if you're trying to get absorbed into Syria. Something about the story isn't adding up, and even though some people, particularly those engaged in organised insurgencies against both Jews and Brits, may have been thinking along the lines of Palestinian national identity, there's no good reason to believe that such views were widespread among Arabs. I mean, another point that's come to my mind, well, just because they want to be part of a greater Syria doesn't mean they don't have a regional identity. I mean, look at Germany. Despite Germany being a national culture, there are many different German groups. There's Bavarians, there are Prussians, there are Saxons, there are Westphalians. And what does a Bavarian not become Bavarian just because they're part of Germany? I think this is a stupid argument.
And of course, and Austrians, like Austrians have had their entire national identity for centuries, and they were a separate German people. You know, this argument is it's an error in categorization. And I want to read a passage of a different source, Mr. John Bagot Glubb, in his book A Short History of the Arab Peoples. And there's a reason he calls them the Arab peoples. And this is something just King Crocoduck doesn't understand, because I genuinely don't think I genuinely think his Zionism gets in the way of his actual like scholarship, or or the way he looks in this manner. So in the introduction of this book, Glubb talks about the different types of Arabs. And there are different types of Arabs. You know, Saudis and Libyans or Algerians are not the same people, even though they all speak Arabic, and even though you can argue there's a genetic, ethnic lineage that you can trace them back to. They're not the same at all. And Glubb, you know, because he spent so much time in the Middle East, understood that there were significant differences. And yeah, it's like the idea that when you think of the idea of Syria itself was just this is another omission that I despise in this kind of thinking, because he just doesn't know the region. I mean, Greater Syria was just the entire East Mediterranean Arab world. That didn't mean there weren't local identities within them. There were, like, Lebanese was not a national identity until the French Mandate, for example. But it was part, again, like, when you have an empire that doesn't have, you know, national borders, that doesn't mean, it's like, the local identities don't correspond to the national borders. I'm like, of course they don't. There were no borders pre-1921. You want to add something to that before I quote John Bagot Glubb?
No, carry on, please.
All right, okay. So the first group he talks about is the Central Arabians, which are the people we all think about when we think of Arabs. We think of Saudis, Qataris, Omanis, you know, Bahrain, and the like Kuwaitis. Like the actual Gulf Arabs are the Central Arabians. The second group of Arabs are the Syrians. And again, this is exactly what I mean when I say this. The Syrians, including the Lebanese and the Arabs of Palestine. Because this is a cultural grouping. Syrians, Palestinians, and Lebanese are literally the same cultural group in every way, shape, or form. They are distinct from the Central Arabs, and which is like most prominently the Saudis. You can tell the difference between a Saudi and a Syrian. You can tell the difference between a Saudi and a Palestinian very easily, not just in the way they dress, like their national dress, but in their dialect as well. But I'm going to read John Bagot Glubb. So when he says Syria, he means Greater Syria, encompassing Lebanon and Palestine. Syria forms a complete contrast to Saudi Arabia. Whereas no foreign invaders were tempted by Arabia, the history of Syria, and Lebanon and Palestine, is little more than a list of foreign invasions. The climate of Syria was tempting to races from colder northern countries. Moreover, the long, narrow strip of country from Aleppo to Gaza, confined by the Mediterranean on one side and the desert on the other, constituted an isthmus joining Asia and Eastern Europe to Africa. From the dawn of history, an endless succession of invading armies and migrating nations traveled up and down this Syrian causeway between Aleppo and Gaza. In 539 BC, Syria was conquered by the Persians, and 333 BC by Alexander the Great. Therefore, until after the Arab conquests in 636 AD, Syria remained Greek or Roman for 1,000 years, a period during which extensive immigration took place from Greece, Italy, and other Mediterranean countries. The Syrians, and Lebanese and Palestinians, I'm just going to keep saying that for the benefit of the audience, are racially unrelated to the Arabs of Arabia. Many of their characteristics resemble those of the Greeks, particularly their extreme intellectual subtlety. As professors, philosophers, and lawyers, they supplied a considerable number of intellectual leaders of Rome. Like many intellectuals, they are unpractical in ordinary life and are incapable of compromise. Intellectually, a proposition is correct or erroneous. More practical minds accept the statement that half a loaf is better than no bread. But not so the intellectual. Syrians, Lebanese and Palestinians included, who migrate, achieve honors and distinctions in every country, but at home their subtlety often lacks realism. They are socially charming, extremely courteous, and the heirs of thousands of years of culture. The Syrians are thus not only racially unrelated to the Arabians, but in many ways they're opposites. The Arabians are distinguished by practicality and common sense, the Syrians by subtlety and intellectual theories. And you can see this in the entire Palestinian intellectual scene. Like, for example, like Edward Said. Like, there's a reason why Edward Said went to the logical extremes of, you know, his postmodern political theory and his ideas on Orientalism. This is very much a characteristic of the Semitic group of people on the Eastern Mediterranean that are not Central Arabs. Would you like to add anything to that?
No, I mean, there's many other intellectuals. I mean, for example, Albert Harani, the Anglo-Lebanese historian. Obviously, again, there's lots of scholars from that group of people. So it's certainly true what Gleb is saying there in terms of their intellectual capacity. But I mean, that bit about the inability to compromise, so that's very true when you look at especially groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, or a lot of these other. Yeah, there's a strain towards fanaticism there.
Yeah, but I mean, the main crux of what I was saying is just, you know, just because the identity doesn't correspond to the national boundaries of what we consider Palestine doesn't mean there were no such thing as Palestinians. And this is just something King Crocoduck doesn't understand. It's like, what is the difference between a Frenchman in Burgundy and a Frenchman in Alsace-Lorraine? Like, Alsace-Lorraine has a lot of German intermixture between it, correct? Does that make it any less French than Burgundy? No. You can't describe them as two separate groups of people, even though they have, you know, their local differences.
No, exactly.
I mean, in the American context, this would be like saying because the Texans were their own country at one point and fought a war, had their own president and Sam Houston and fought the Mexicans and won, and then they had aspirations to join the United States of America, is like saying, well, there was never a Texan identity then because they had aspirations to join the greater United States. Well, that isn't true. If you ever go to Texas, you realize there is a difference in the Anglo population that settled Texas. They have their own, you know, different cultures, different traditions, the way they do things, like the way the land and like the way they settled Texas, and the fact they fought a war against a foreign country plays a major role in that. It's like his logic just doesn't make any sense, and like you said, it's a category error.
He's importing a Western I don't mean to sound like a like a third worldist. I mean, like, he's literally taking a Western conception of an ethno state and importing it into the Middle East, which has never, which doesn't work at all. It just doesn't make categorical sense if you know anything about the region.
Well, I would push back and say it's rather a modern 19th century notion of an ethno-state rather than necessarily a Western one. Because ultimately, this is an idea that came out of the French Revolution. No, we've got to have these rational, organized nation states where everybody's interchangeable, all shares a common language, and that's how politics and the globe should be organized. And it's just got exported ultimately, and the West was just the pioneers in that way of doing things ultimately.
No, I agree. I agree with that. That's fair. Should we continue?
Yes. Okay. So, Palestine, 2,000 years of imperialism and colonialism. As I mentioned earlier, Palestinian historiography is burdened with bottomless ironies, but this is perhaps nowhere more evident than in the name they chose for themselves, Palestinians. The name Palestine first appears in the historical records in the 5th century BC, when Herodotus wrote of it as a district of Syria in the histories. He was apparently under the impression that the Philistines, who we now know to have emigrated from Crete circa 1175 BC, was the dominant political unit conquered by the Assyrians when they captured the southern Levant. In reality, the region was populated by all manner of peoples, including the Israelites of these, most enduring were the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Sometimes these kingdoms were independent and free, other times they were a district within the greater imperial power. And obviously this time you've got the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah, but you've also got some other states. You've obviously got the Phoenicians to the north, and then you've got the Philistine over here in what is now roughly Gaza, and then there's the others. Ancient religious tradition characterizes the Philistines as the enemies of the Jews, and their numbers dwindled as the region changed hands from empire to empire. By the time the Romans conquered the region and renamed it Judea, a derivative of Judah, the Philistines had long since ceased to exist as any kind of political unit. But the memory of that role as the nemesis of the Jews lived on, and in an act of imperialistic cruelty, Rome renamed the province Syria Palestina upon suppressing the Bar Kokhba revolt in 136 AD, I should say. The spirit in which they chose this name is akin to that which might motivate modern-day Israel's enemies to call the region Hitlerlands. The purpose of this name was to humiliate the Jews and crush their national spirit.
That is pure psycho. That is pure mind reading and psychoanalysis. Come on, dude, come on. Never. Just please continue.
Literally 2,000 years ago, and they still bring this stuff up.
Never forget.
I mean,
literally everyone who has hated the Jews is Hitler.
Mm-hmm. But it's like it doesn't even make it's not even logically consistent because the name Syria Palestina just gets its name from two local geographic names. Syria's obviously from Syria, and Palestina is obviously derived from Philistine. So there's a logical consistency in the naming there, where like just calling it Hitlerland is like no, because that's nothing to do with geography. That's just a man who didn't like the Jews. It's just.
I mean, it was also about reorganizing the borders of the internal territories in the Roman Empire. It's like the new borders doesn't correspond to the old borders, therefore it's going to be given a new name. That just makes sense.
Yeah, it's like I guess I'm sure the Emperor Hadrian, when he crushed the Jews in that revolt, he had the ability to see into the future. I know what would really annoy these Jews. Let's call it Palestine. Okay. The first time the region becomes Palestine is as an administrative district within Rome. It never becomes an independent state. Okay, but
okay.
I'm going to go to a point I made last time about Ireland. Ireland has spent most of its history where it was Christian and had a Irish identity as literally being a region dominated by England or Britain. So by that logic, Ireland shouldn't exist as a nation state because it spent most of its history under British or English rule.
Or the Kurds. I mean, like you don't even have to leave the region. Like, do the Kurds exist because they don't have their own state?
No, exactly. But that cruelty was promptly compounded by the expulsion of the majority of Jews from their homeland, kicking off the 2,000-year ordeal that would come to define most of Jewish history. Thus did the Roman Empire seeking to destroy the Jews as a political unit, but the second exile in an attempt to erase all memory of Jewish connection to their homeland. And the thing is, he says this like this was unique to the Romans. It's like many empires in the ancient world did this. I mean, you mentioned the Assyrians. The Assyrians were notorious for doing this. They did this to many people. And again, the Babylonians did it to the Jews as well. But again, they're another example. And in fairness, you did mention them earlier. But yeah, so you want to say something, AE?
Yeah, I was going to say even Cyrus the Great, or maybe it was early Persian dynasty when they conquered the Levant, like removed these people from the land. This was a very common tactic, by the way, that pretty much all empires throughout history have done when there's a troublesome population that constantly rebels. Well, you remove them and you settle it with people who are going to be more loyal to you. That's not something unique, you know.
So just to come in, it's funny you say that because I'm actually reading at the moment Sean McMeegan's most recent book, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism, and the last chapter I just read was all about the post-war sort of restructuring of Eastern Europe. And literally the Soviets did this. They ethnically cleansed millions of Germans and shoved them into what's now West and East Germany, ethnically cleansing Prussia. And then, of course, then they just moved millions of Poles from places in Belarus and Ukraine over into these new territories in the West, which are now part of Poland. So it even happens in the modern context. And even if we look at somewhere like Israel, during the Mandate, Jews were allowed to mass migrate into the Mandate, and they committed terror attacks when the British tried to slow that down because it was causing ethnic violence.
I just wanted to come in and add he might as well just have said, you know, for no reason at all. For no reason at all, the Romans just decided to kick us out of our ancestral homeland and erase our memory of our connection to the kingdom of Judea or whatever. Just like for no reason at all. No, I wonder what happened. You know, I wonder why the Romans did what they did.
Exactly. But the Jews did not forget. After 2,000 years in exile, the Jews retained their national identity, updated it, even along with the other nations that had been touched by the Enlightenment. Meanwhile, the region changed hands many more times. The Byzantines, Egyptians, and Turks were the only some of the many foreign powers that would come to occupy the land. Consequently, its name and borders constantly changed. The name Palestine remained in use along the same lines as the names Dixie and Scandinavia. Very interesting, the use of that term Dixie. Because if I remember, the last time he makes some disparaging like comparisons between like the Middle East treatment of the Jews and like the slaves in the South.
Well, yeah, because he's transplanting basically American boomer truth liberal narrative onto the Middle East to fit his Zionist agenda, and racist Southerners are like the archetype of like evil, basically.
I want you to finish that paragraph because I think this is a very important point.
Okay, sure. Dixie and Scandinavia are not and have never been the names of sovereign political entities. These have only ever been the names for certain regions. Similarly, Palestine, also known as the Holy Land and other such names, was never sovereign. It was only ever a region under the jurisdiction of foreign powers.
Okay, so Florida is the name we give to the state of Florida, which is not independent, which was not one of the 13 original colonies. I mean, yeah, no, I don't believe it was.
No, it was not part of the original 13 colonies.
No, it was not. But we call the people there Floridians. I mean, like at least in the official language, just because they're not sovereign. Like this is not an argument. You don't have to. You don't have to be a citizen of Dixie. You don't have to have a passport from Dixie to be from Dixie. I don't understand what he's trying to get at.
That's like saying somebody born in Norway isn't Scandinavian, because the colloquial term Scandinavia isn't an ethnic identity of itself. Well, literally. It is. It's people. Yeah. Like that's kind of stupid. Again,
I mean, what's even stupider is, of course, in America, you know what Americans called. They're called Yankees, or specifically, I know that's sometimes used to refer to New Englanders specifically. What you're saying that New England doesn't exist, that America shouldn't have a state. It's like how far are you going to go with this, Crocoduck? This is also tiresome, isn't it?
It's
Indeed,
just special it's just special pleading in every case.
No, absolutely.
It is basically
And,
like we're the chosen people, so like it doesn't matter like whatever happened in history. Like we're always the eternal victim and everything basically.
and also, I want to push back on Scandinavia. Yes, Scandinavia has never been a unified political state, but we have had something very close. We had the Kalmar Union, which was a personal union between the kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And at that time, Norway controlled Iceland, and Finland was part of Sweden. So literally, the widest possible description you could use of the Scandinavian region was politically unified under one monarch. Okay, it wasn't a unified nation state in our modern sense, but still, that is a political union. You can't. Again, it's just totally false what he's claiming here. So, indeed, the lines on the map often cut. Sorry.
Yeah, even if it wasn't a political union, therefore Scandinavians don't exist. Like what?
I know. Indeed, the lines on the map often cut right through the land. The border between the Jerusalem and Beirut districts of the Ottoman Empire split the region into multiple sanjuks, which were subdivisions of administrative districts called vilayets. By the time the first Zionists arrived, the land had been split into 2 vilayets and incorporated territories not traditionally associated with Palestine. Okay, well, that's what happens. Geographic units are sometimes subdivided into different areas. You know, that's not
same ethnicity, and when the same ethnicity lives in in the region, it's like it's going to get split arbitrarily. Of course, it will be.
Yeah. From the rivers to the sea, the sanjuks of Alka, Balka, Jerusalem, plus parts of Man and Harun will be free. So disingenuous. The last time a sovereign political unit existed in the region prior to the creation of the State of Israel was in the 6th century BC. The name of that state was the Kingdom of Judah. The last time a sovereign political unit existed in the region prior to the creation of the State of Israel was in the 6th century BC. The name of that state was the Kingdom of Judah. No, this is incredibly disingenuous. Okay, so he's trying to argue that because there wasn't like some locally based state in that region, there's no sovereign political units. Well, that's because the area. So just because an area is part of a larger empire or state, therefore that region isn't sovereign. It's like, well, again, let's go back to the Arab conquest. The Levant and much of the Middle East was conquered by the Arabs and converted to Islam, and they became Arabized. They came to identify with this new culture that was established in the Levant. So if there was a government that represented their interests, such as an Arab caliphate, I think they would have felt bloody sovereign, wouldn't you?
I can't even formulate an argument because this is literal special pleading. Like if this was any other state, like okay, the last time I'll try to think of an analogy. I don't know. The last time there's a sovereign state before, like I don't know, the Apache Nation was sovereign in freaking Arizona before the existence of the United States. Okay, it's the and.
Mm.
And I can't even come up with an analogy to illustrate how stupid this argument.
Also, his claim is just kind of patently untrue because the Eastern Romans administered the province. The Iranians, the Persians, so this idea that it wasn't a administrated state is kind of not true. It's not.
What he's trying to say is that the region has only been a province of a larger empire, and that the last time what he's trying to get at, an indigenous state, was this Kingdom of Judah. And I'm just saying, well, that's irrelevant. That doesn't disprove the cultural changes in that region and the fact that thousands, if not millions, of Palestinians have a certain identity that's been built up over centuries. You can't just erase that.
Okay. So Italy. The last time Italy had a sovereign Italian state was the Roman Empire. And in the meantime, between 1870 and 450 BC, like it was controlled by the Austrians, the Visigoths, you can name a dozen other European ethnicities who controlled the Italian peninsula in the 1500 years between 450 AD to 1870 AD. Does that mean there were no such thing as Italians?
And again, if we go into the idea of sovereignty, even then, even when Italy was part of those many different empires, there was also periods where it was just divided into different political units. Those states were still sovereign. And again, we're going back to this idea of original identity. They didn't necessarily see themselves as Italians, they saw themselves as Venetians or Lombards or Sicilians. But ultimately, they were then united into Italy because of the efforts of the House of Savoy. So, God, it's almost like with this, he wants to have his cake and eat it.
I mean, it's like saying because the Greeks were the last holdout of the Eastern Roman Empire and they called themselves Romans, even up until like the 17th and 18th century, there were no Greeks because they called themselves Romans. It's like that level of argumentation he's presenting here.
With this information in hand, we can continue to modify Cooper's analogy of the Jews who return to the occupied house. The house is not owned by the Palestinian Arab inhabitants that the Jews find upon their return. It's owned by the Ottoman Empire. Prior to that, it was owned by the Mamluk Empire, and so on, until we get to the owners who most recently lived inside the house, the Jews. By 1920, the ownership changes hands again, this time to the British Empire. At no point in history do the Arab Palestinians own the house.
Who owned the house before the Jews?
The thing is, I've got a better analogy. The house was occupied by Palestinians. They were just renting it from whatever sovereign overlords there were, and the Jews came along and are basically trying to evict them ultimately.
Yeah, and to follow King Crocoduck's logic, who owned the house before the Jews? There were other people in Palestine before the Jews. This is the Native American argument that always happens in America.
No, exactly. At some point in this whole conversation, it becomes natural to wonder who exactly are the Palestinian people, and why do so many of them have names like Al-Mazri, literally the clan from Egypt, Al-Baghdadi, the clan from Baghdad, and Al-Farizi, the clan from Persia. Most importantly, why is there no record of anyone with the name Al-Philistini, the clan from Palestine, prior to the formation of Israel in 1948? Shouldn't we expect to find lots of people in Palestine with the name Al-Philistini? Where are they?
Well, Mr. King Crocoduck. Let's go through some cities in Palestine, and I can tell you where those families came from. Cities in, I'm just going to Google this real quick. Cities in Palestine.
No, it's okay.
Because I can name you some names off the top of my head. Nabulsi. Nabulsi comes from the town of Nablus. So that family has been in Nablus for fucking 3,000 years, or however old Nablus is. That's just one example. There are literally thousands of examples. That's just off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm.
This is to the point where he's literally saying, so the Persians like have different names, so that means like they're not from the land. Basically, is the level of argumentation.
Palestine was an administrative name. They were most of the people's names came from the city they were a part of. For example, like Nabulsi,
or the region they're from. Yeah,
or the region, or the broader region they're from. Right. I'll give you. I have a friend. I have a friend, Beiruti. Like, I am from Beirut. Does that make them not Lebanese? No, of course it does. They were just from Beirut. That's what it meant.
And another example. Just go back to the ancient Celtic Britain. The name Britain comes from the Roman name Britannia for the province. So before it was even a British nation or a country bearing that name, you have a province ascribed. This geographic area has a name ascribed to it by the fucking Romans. So, well, according to Green Crocodile's logic, that Britain has no claim to it being a sovereign country because it was named after a Roman province. Ugh. I won't keep you in suspense. The modern... sorry.
No, go ahead.
I won't keep you in suspense. The modern-day Palestinian people are the descendants of Muslims and Christians who conquered and subsequently flocked to the region, though some are descendants of Jews who succumbed to the pressure of conversion. None of them possess a national identity continuous with the ancient Philistines. They celebrate no holidays, observe no traditions, maintain no cultural continuity indicative of any solidarity with that ancient sovereign entity. This raises the question of why they call themselves Palestinians, and the answer cuts to the heart of the irony I've been alluding to. They only call themselves Palestinians because this was the name given to the region by the last foreign power to conquer the land, when the British Empire established the colonial entity known as the Mandate of Palestine in 1920. They did so with the understanding that this would be a temporary arrangement. As part of the mandate system, they would colonize the labor and resources of different regions under the pretext that they were helping the locals establish state institutions, after which they would depart and leave the newly formed states to their own devices. The British Mandate incorporated the territories now known as the modern states of Israel and Jordan, as well as the territories of Gaza and the West Bank. Right. Again, this is the thing. Cultures and peoples change with the course of history as conquerors and new states come in, and these shifts happen over time. It's like those changes don't stop the people developing and having a culture in a certain region.
Not just that. Going back to the map. Okay, so what is King Crocoduck trying to say? That so all the Arabs west of the Jordan River were actually Jordanian. Is that what he's trying to say? Because they were part of the same mandate, and the two states that came up were Israel and Jordan. Because if that's his argument, that is completely retarded. The reason why there is a huge distinction between the West Bank and the East Bank of the Jordan River, because they were not the same people. And if that's his argument, that like the people in the West Bank were always Jordanian even before the creation of Israel in 1948, then he literally does not know anything about the entire region.
Again, I don't think he really cares. I think this is all just to furnish his bullshit shilling for Zionism. Right. In the case of Palestine, colonization proceeded mainly through the development of a pipeline running from Mosul to Haifa. It also proceeded rather substantially through the procurement of money from Jews who were desperate to return to their homeland. If a Jew wanted to set up a farm on a plot of untouched land, they would not be able to do so for free. They had to pay the colonial power in the region, which extracted this wealth from them to enrich the British Empire. The local Arabs, however, did not take kindly to the resulting influx of European Jews. By 1948, a nascent Palestinian national identity was forming, but it was no match for the Jewish national identity, which had withstood 2 millennia of persecution under exile. This is why, by the time the British left in 1948, the Jews had developed state institutions and cohesive military apparatuses, while the local Arabs have not. The former could unite as a cohesive political unit despite barriers in both language and proximate diasporic history, while the latter could not even agree whether they wanted to be absorbed into Syria, Jordan, or become an independent political unit, despite having a common language and history. The only thing they agreed upon was that the Jews must not have sovereignty anywhere in the land. Well, I've got a better explanation for this, Crocoduck. There's something called elite theory, which is that the local small minority that is organized will always beat the greater unorganized mass. And that is why Israel has been successful vis-a-vis Palestine. Because, yes, there's fewer Jews, but they've been much better organized than the Palestinians and the Arabs as a whole. Would you guys say that's a fair point?
Yes, but also military support as well, because we have to go back to 1948. Who was the biggest backer of Israel? It was America and Britain, who gave them like modern, like Sherman tanks. compared to the Arab armies who faced them, who, although in numbers were superior, had World War II equipment. So that was also a major factor in that.
You can go back even further, before the British even, before the first Arab-Israeli War. I mean, the Arabs were literally disarmed by the 1936 Arab Revolt. This was... he says this as if there was an even playing field. As if the Jewish community and the Palestinians both could have formed cohesive military apparatuses and state institutions. The Palestinian leadership was killed off in the 1936 revolt, and the population was disarmed to the point where that's it. That's all I need to. That's all I even need to say. The British did not disarm and kill off the Jewish leadership in Palestine during the Mandate. So of course they had the advantage.
Thank you. And just to come back to AE, most of the Israelis' equipment actually came from the Soviets and Czechoslovakia in the 1948 war. Interestingly, there was probably more British equipment on the Arab side vis-a-vis the Arab Legion in Jordan,
and the French. The French were very active in arming the active in arming the Jewish groups.
Oh yes, so thank you. And yeah, Naomi Al-Khalsa mentions that France was also a huge backer of Israel before 1967. Yep. Right. Okay. Right. Following their defeat in the 1948 war, their resentment and trauma crystallized into what we today recognize as the Palestinian national identity. The story that defines this identity is one which casts Israel as a colonial project of an imperial power and the Palestinians as a colonized people. And therein lies the central irony of Palestinian historiography. The name that they chose for themselves, Palestinians, is the name given to the region by the Roman Empire to humiliate the Jews. It's the name that condemned the Jews to 2,000 years of exile and persecution under Christian and Muslim rule. It's the name given to the region once more by the British colonial power that extorted the wealth of Jews desperate to return home, and which, as we shall see, closed the gates of a homeland just when the Jews needed it most. This name, Palestine, carries 2,000 years of imperial and colonial aggression against the Jewish people, and this is the identity embraced by the side of the conflict presuming to be on the side of anti-imperialism and colonialism. The gods of heavy-handed irony wept. See, no, the Jews are the real, colonized, enslaved peoples. Those evil, tyrannical, oppressive Palestinians. I'm sorry, Crocodile. This is how human affairs work. Two can play at that game. Human history is not just about one side victimizing, brutalizing another side. There are mutual wars, genocides, death, famine, rapes across all human civilization.
It's very hard for me to take King Crocoduck seriously as a thinker after reading those two fucking paragraphs. I am trying to maintain the discourse, as we say, and it's very hard for me to take this seriously. What?
Yeah.
He is not wrong when King Crocoduck. I'm being as charitable as I can possibly be. He is not wrong when he says the Palestinian identity obviously coalesced post the Nakba of 1948. This is something we call fucking ethnogenesis. This is just what happens. Okay. There was a name for the people in this region. That name was not very meaningful because it was just the administrative boundaries of whatever empire was there at the fucking time. And then when you actually traumatize the people and you have a what's it called? God damn it. I can't remember the technical psychological term for it. But yeah, when you a war is a traumatic experience that forms Like I said, this is the basis of the Palestinian ethnogenesis. The fact that they were kicked out by the Israelis and driven out and exiled. The same way, actually, ironically, the same way this is the Jewish ethnogenesis. Fucking 3,000 years ago, when they were kicked out by the Babylonians. So, the Jewish identity is not legitimate because it doesn't apply to the Palestinians.
Just to look at another example in the Middle East, I mean, look at the case of the Armenians. I mean, the Armenians have been there for thousands of years. You know, would he dare question the right to a state of the Armenian peoples after all the stuff they've gone through?
Exactly, and the Armenian ethnogenesis, there was always an Armenian people, but you can't deny that the Armenian genocide had a huge role in defining the political existence of the community. That's just undeniable, especially in the 20th century.
It's interesting, isn't it, that now I've said that there's a very interesting kind of chutzpah amongst both Zionist and Turkish nationalists, isn't there? But part of their identity seems to be rooted in like just denying the existence of another people who they've brutalized ultimately.
Well, no,
it's no wonder they got along so well.
I mean, it's even worse than that. The Jewish people and the Palestinian people are defined by exile. But it's only legitimate for the Jews because it happened 3,000 years ago, and it's illegitimate for the Palestinians because it happened 80 years ago.
It's like, oh god, do you remember when we did that other stream with Years and Newsfist, and we had a Konstantin Kissin, and he was like trying to say, oh, because like proportionately a higher proportion of Jews were killed in the October 7th attacks, it's proportionally much more harmful that Israel suffered it. That's it. It was proportionally worse than 9/11 for America, or some retarded logic like that.
It was 11 times worse than 9/11.
It was the worst thing that ever happened, ever. Literally ever.
Right. Well, we've got 0.4, we've got this, and then 0.5, so we're getting there. Assumption 4.
I don't know how much more I can take.
Be strong. Assumption 4, the understandable resistance of the colonized. Palestinian historiography insists that the lack of a national identity among the Arabs of the region does not preclude the possibility that they were nevertheless the victims of colonization. After all, Native American tribes never had a state of their own, yet who could claim that the European colonists had not colonized them? It's literally in the name, colonists. Let's put to one side the fact that, unlike with Jews and the Holy Land, the European colonists did not have national identities which had formed in the New World, and maintained neither material nor ideological connections to the land in their absence. There was a crucial point that consistently gets overlooked in attempts at characterizing Zionism as a colonial project, and that is the role of exploitation, colonialism as euphemism. Okay. So ultimately, because European man settled the New World, and because they did not, as you claim, identify with their home country, that somehow doesn't give them the right to a state, even though they did form a new identity and have formed a state. This is a mess.
No, I think if he argues that the Europeans exploited the Native Americans and that the Israelis did not exploit the fucking Palestinians, I'm gonna lose my shit.
It looks like he might what he's gearing up to do. Sorry, colonialism is euphemism. The dictionary definition of colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. I emphasize the conjunctive article and to highlight the fact that all these criteria need to be satisfied for something to qualify as colonialism. So the exploiting it economically part is significant. It represents the entire purpose of a colonial enterprise, to siphon away resources from a colonial outpost to the colonizing motherland. This is the nature of the relationship between colonizer and colonized, and that nature is conspicuously absent from the history of Zionism. As Jews did not siphon away Palestine's non-existent resources to a distant motherland, they were in the motherland and they invested everything into developing it. Oh my god!
This is okay. This is imperialism. This is not what colonialism means. Please continue.
I mean, this is so stupid. It's like when the British turned up in Australia and started settling and colonizing it. There's this really stupid Marxist take on the British Industrial Revolution or economic strength of the 19th century, the so-called drain theory, where Britain was only rich, could have an Industrial Revolution because she just turned up to these wealthy countries in the Asia and Africa and just sucked them fucking dry, and then it all was taken back to Britain. And that's why Britain owes reparations. It's a complete bullshit theory. The British Empire didn't make Britain wealthy. Britain had an empire because she was wealthy, because she could afford the luxury of having one, because empires are fucking expensive. And go back to the point of Australia. Like when they turned up in Australia to settle, they built up and invested in Australia in that land. They didn't go siphoning it all off to Britain.
I'm genuinely questioning King Crocoduck's intelligence because I know he has to be smarter than this. Colonialism is when you settle a different land. Imperialism is when you invade another country and extract the resources. Like this is basic shit. Like I can't believe I have to distinguish this. Colonialism, if I go into the wilderness and I build a house and I start chopping down trees and I eventually, I don't know, build a mill for wood. That is I can't I can't believe I'm having this conversation.
No, his logic doesn't make any sense because I believe him had mentioned the British Empire. Well, our good friend A did a good economic analysis, and like the British Empire was an economic drain on Britain. Actually, there was very few productive colonies in the British Empire. It was more of a drain to keep the empire guarded and like staffed and everything. So it's more of the reverse, actually. And again, this goes back to like leftist, like basically theory of like the reason Africa is so poor is because Europeans like took everything from the land, or something like that, basically, which is just undoubtedly untrue. And again, he's bringing this up again as a cudgel, basically.
Yeah, because I mean, Africa was such a hive of advanced civilization before the scramble in the 1870s and 80s. Now, wasn't it?
Yes, but that's what these people literally make the argument for. These people.
I need to stress this because this entire argument is bothering me. Colonialism is about the transfer of populations. The British did not colonize Palestine because British people didn't set up shop in Palestine. They colonized Australia. They colonized the United States. They colonized Canada because there were enormous the French colonized Algeria because French people or British people left their homeland to establish a new home in a foreign territory. That is colonialism. You can have... Now, what he's talking about is imperialism. And the reason he's not saying it's imperialism is because the Jews can't be imperialistic. Because that would put them in the position of the strong, not the oppressed and the weak.
It's Schrodinger's Zionist, isn't it? With the oppressors, but we're also the oppressed at the same time.
Zionism is a colonial project. It is about the transfer of Jews to a foreign land.
This is literally in the founding documents of Zionism.
This does not apply to the fucking... It bothers me that this person doesn't understand his own fucking definitions.
Right. Okay, let's move on. Britain builds a pipeline from Mosul to Haifa to control the region's oil and enrich the motherland. That's textbook colonialism. France takes over Morocco and uproots its male population to serve as cannon fodder for the glory of the motherland in the First World War. Again, textbook.
Literally, no. Literally, no, that is not textbook.
And for starters, yes, the French did use colonial troops in World War One, but from my knowledge, they were mostly black Africans they used and not Moroccans. So he's got that wrong. And secondly, building a pipeline from Mosul to Haifa, that wasn't to enrich Britain as a territorial country. That was there to facilitate global strategic control to fuel the Royal Navy, because it was the largest navy on Earth. So again, the empire was there for strategic purposes. It wasn't that they're there to get rich.
Also, the term exploitation comes with the connotation that there's like somebody's resources that you're stealing that they're using. I don't think anybody was using the oil before the British built this pipeline. Maybe a tangent there, but
no. What are the Jews doing? Throughout the podcast, Cooper uses phrases like the Zionists were freaking everyone out, kicking down doors and making a big mess, or the Zionists were colonizing the region. But what was the actual reality on the ground? What happens when we speak clearly in place of these meaningless euphemisms? Truly, I have no idea what doors the Zionists kept kicking down, but I'm sure the carpenters in the region are happy with all the business the Jews must be bringing them, what with all these broken doors everywhere. Okay, well, it's a euphemism, Crocoduck, but you probably know that. As it turns out, when we cut the BS and stop using euphemisms, the complaint comes down to the fact that the Jews were moving in and buying private property from Arabs, no longer abiding by the jizya and dimitude that the Arabs had grown so accustomed to over the centuries. The Jews were not exploiting the labour or resources of the locals. They were moving in and buying private property, exercising the same property rights that everyone else in the region enjoyed. And there's got this image of a transaction going on. Zionist colonizers exploiting the local Arab landowners by checks notes, purchasing their property in mutually consensual transactions, the bastards. Okay, I'm sure that happened once or twice, but...
It did. It happened with 6% of the land. The Jews that purchased private property owned 6% of Palestine by the 1940s. No one denies this. This is not deniable. But please continue.
But we all know what happened to that other 94% now, don't we? So
exactly.
And the European Jews that were moving in had, unlike their cousins who'd remained in the Middle East over the centuries, developed an appetite for the Enlightenment they brought with them, such radical notions as equality under the law and freedom of religion, things which were formerly unheard of in the Middle East. Okay, freedom of religion did not exist in the Middle East. Well, how do you define freedom of religion? Because, I mean, okay, non-Muslims were dhimmis and had to pay the jizya, but they weren't banned from practicing their faith. So unless you're talking about paying a tax for practicing your religion as a definition of freedom of religion, I mean, that's a very modern concept.
What year were Jews allowed to serve in the British government without converting to Protestantism?
Well, I think that would be Catholic emancipation, which was would have been the 1820s. Because despite the name,
the 1820s.
Because despite the name, that act basically removed all restrictions on non-Protestants for serving as an MP or in other public positions.
So the Ottoman government had been hiring Jews for over 400 years prior to the British doing it, and the West had freedom of religion.
Yeah, it's dumb, right? These were not the servile, dignified Jews that the local Arabs had come to know and expect subordination from. These Jews were free, and the British colonizers who took over the region in 1920 shared these sentiments. And this again, what I love is the British are colonizers, but the Jews, we're not colonizers. If colonization means de facto overthrowing Islamic traditions of dimitude and jizya and replacing them with Western norms of equality under the law, then sure, colonization proceeded in earnest. I mean, I would dispute that there's equality under the law for all people in Israel.
Overthrowing Islamic traditions of dimitude and jizya and replacing them with Western norms of equality under the law. This has nothing to do with colonization. This is called regime change.
even under his definition, like the state of Israel doesn't abide by his modern liberal definition because Arab Jews and other like non-Ashkenazi Jews are very much discriminated against. I mean, I literally just saw an article today where Israel admitted to sterilizing Ethiopian Jews. So go ahead and tell me again about that equality under the law thing again.
Arab Israelis, which are not Arab Jews. Like Arab Israelis are literally second-class citizens.
Yeah.
Okay, but by this logic, the American South was colonized by the Yankees when they came in and forced a change in the labor laws. Certainly, that's how the KKK saw it when they subsequently went round butchering uppity blacks who were exercising their newfound rights. And that's how the local Arabs saw it when they went round killing westernized Jews who had the temerity not to bow to their Muslim masters when they passed them in the streets.
This is
Again,
pure projection. Pure fucking projection.
He loves coming back to this Southern comparison. So, when you say it clearly without euphemism, the historiography of the Palestinian side gets its door kicked down. But Cooper is unlikely to be satisfied with this rejoinder. He repeatedly emphasizes that religion is not implicated on the Arab side of the conflict's origins, and that the fundamental cause of consternation was mass migration from Europe. The problem Cooper is likely to argue isn't that the migrants were Jews, it's that they were seen as European. We can infer from this that had mass migration occurred from regions with which the Palestinian Arabs personally identified, say Arabs migrating from other parts of the Arab world, like modern-day Iraq or Syria, then there wouldn't have been a problem. I mean, there may have been some issues, but it wouldn't have been as much, I think, as the Ashkenazi Jews coming in.
I mean, yes. The problem was that they were not Arab or Muslim. If they were Arab or Muslim, there wouldn't have been a problem of mass immigration. That's what it fucking means.
And it's not even just that either. It's like they're coming in with the Zionist ideology behind it, with like their armed gangs of Likud, literally like to cause terrorism, to remove them from the land by force. So it's not even just they're coming in with mass immigration.
If it was fucking Japanese Shintoists, it would have been a problem, because these people are not native to the fucking country.
No, exactly. Or I don't know, what if Chupa Chewenge and his Nigerian friends just turned up one day? They wouldn't have been happy with that either.
Oh, no, they were never happy with that. No.
Right. On the surface, this thought experiment might appear to support the claim that the problem was the perception of colonization, not religiously motivated bigotry against Jews, and yet consider the following. Suppose that instead of Arabs from other parts of the Middle East, it had been Jews from other parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Jews from Yemen, Jews from Iraq, Jews from Afghanistan and Libya, all pouring into Palestine rather than European Jews, all united in their Zionist dream to re-establish their national homeland. What then? Would Cooper expect us to believe that the Palestinians would have been all right with this, that they would have been fine with Jews from other parts of the Arab-speaking world establishing national sovereignty in lands formerly conquered by Muslims? That's because the Jews of the Middle East were not fucking Zionists, as you and I, Hunger, have discussed in a previous stream in our Tratham House version series. They were basically forced out of their country because of the Arab Muslim majority who wanted to scapegoat a population so they could just loot their property.
And yeah, this is the thing. It's like all of the Jews of the Middle East, we mentioned this last week, they could have moved back to the motherland anytime they wanted. There were no borders in the Ottoman Empire. Why did the Jews stay in Iraq? Why did they stay in Syria? Why did they stay in Morocco? Not because they were forced to stay there. They clearly had no interest in going back to the motherland and starting a national homeland. And like, first of all, that's called fucking subversion. If you try to overthrow the fucking government of the locality you're moving to.
Yeah, but he can't go saying the Israelis are subversive now, can he?
Oh, perish the thought.
There's an unambiguously correct answer to this question. Hang on. I know I didn't skip anything. It's the answer that screams out to us when we study the histories of other ethnic minorities within lands conquered by Muslims, from Druze in Syria to Maronites in Lebanon, from Baha'i in Iran to Kurds in Iraq. It's the answer that screams out to us when we examine the Palestinian attitude towards Israel after surrounding Muslim countries applied intimidation, political violence in several cases, bloody pogroms to ethnically cleanse themselves of 900,000 Jews, most of whom fled to Israel. To this day, Israel enjoys a majority population of Jews descend from the Arabic as opposed to the European diaspora, but this fact has nothing done to assuage Palestinian hatred.
Bullshit.
One moment.
Absolute bullshit. The majority of Jews in Israel are descended from the Middle East. Total bullshit. Israel's a majority Ashkenazi country. It doesn't even make fucking sense. Which is not even to touch on the other minorities he mentions.
Well, I guess he's just trying to be consistent with the 6 million claim now, isn't he?
Which came first, Zionism, or the pogroms against Jews in the Middle East? Which came first? Oh wait,
I think we know the answer to that. Right. The answer to our thought experiment continues screaming out to us when we read their slogans. The Jews are our dogs, their picket signs, water to water, Palestine is Arab, and even their creative works. Here is a poem authored by Sheikh Suleiman al-Taji al-Faruqi in a November 1930 issue of the Jaffa Arab Daily Philistine, summarizing the widespread attitude of Jewish land purchases from the local Arabs. Jews, sons of clinking gold, stop your deceit. We should not be cheated into bartering away our country. The Jews, the weakest of all the peoples, and the least of them, are haggling us for our lands. How can we slumber on? Keep in mind, this was in November 1913. British colonisation of the region would not take place for another 7 years, and Israeli independence would not be declared for another 35. They are not confused about who the migrants are. They are not complaining about European aliens. They're complaining about Jews.
They're literally complaining about European aliens. Because this is an Ashkenazi stereotype, not a Mizrahi stereotype. Mizrahi Jews weren't fucking bankers, okay?
No. The results of our thought experiment suggest that the conflict is not simply about European colonization, but about Jewish sovereignty itself, which would have been resisted regardless of the Jews' geographic origin. Islamic traditions of dominance over non-Muslim minorities played a significant role in shaping the Arab response to Jewish sovereignty, and the efforts of Palestinian historiographers, and by extension Cooper, to downplay this fact is revealing. What's the evidence for colonialism? The accusation of Jewish colonization over the region is restricted to 2 lines of evidence: written records by important Zionist figures and institutions, and the presence of a European colonial power that facilitated Zionist migration. Neither of these survive scrutiny. The founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, is cited by Palestinian historiography as having introduced colonialism into the Zionist project from the outset. Evidence supporting this claim is derived principally from passages of the movement's foundational text, the Jewish State, as well as unsent personal correspondences to colonial figures like Cecil Rhodes. Derivatives of the word colony appear 8 times in the Jewish State, and in no instance does it entail the forceful removal of exploitation of the land's current inhabitants. A characteristic passage reads, "Should the powers declare themselves willing to admit our sovereignty over a neutral piece of land, then the society will enter into negotiations for the possession of this land. Here 2 territories come under consideration, Palestine and Argentine. In both countries, important experiments in colonization have been made, though on the mistaken principle of a gradual infiltration of Jews. An infiltration is bound to end badly. It continues till the inevitable moment when the native population feels itself threatened and forces the government to stop a further influx of Jews. Immigration is consequently futile unless we have the sovereign right to continue such immigration. The Society of Jews will treat with the present masters of the land, putting itself under the protectorate of the European powers. If they prove friendly to the plan, we could offer the present possessors of the land enormous advantages, assume part of the public debt, build new roads for traffic, which our presence in the country would render necessary, and do many other things. The creation of our state would be beneficial to adjacent countries, because the cultivation of a strip of land increases the value of its surrounding districts in innumerable ways. In this context, Herzl's use of the term colonization refers not to the formal practice of colonialism, in which invaders subjugate and exploit a land and its people, but to innocent practice of establishing a community. The Oxford English Dictionary records the two following definitions of the word colony: a country or area under the full or partial political control of another country, typically a distant one, then occupied by settlers from that country; a group of people of one's nationality or ethnic group living in a foreign city or country. Oh, I see. So there's two definitions of colonization. It's just what the Israelis are doing is the positive interpretation of that. Got ya.
Yes, overthrowing the government of the locality and facilitating the importation of a foreign population against the wishes of the locals is not.
Man, where have we seen that before? It sounds so familiar.
That's not subversion. That's not an invasion. That's not. No.
Right. In the parlance of the late 1800s, when Herzl was writing his document, one could sensibly refer to today's community of ethnic Iranians living in Los Angeles as the Persian colony, without implying anything sinister about their intentions. What Palestinian historiographers have effectively done with such passages is to equivocate between the innocent sense of the term that Herzl was using with the sinister meaning associated with characters like Cecil Rhodes. Speaking
Are
of
the
which,
fucking Iranians trying to overthrow the U.S. government?
No.
Are they trying to subject the people of Los Angeles under their laws?
I haven't seen them trying to colonize with a Shia mosque everywhere, and like advocate for mass importation of Iranians into California. It's never happened, so that's quite interesting.
This is something I have to address before we continue this entire argument, because I've read Elan Pape, and yes, Herzl means it originally in his early writings. He means establishing a community. Yeah, no shit. And then, again, Zionism evolves over time. Once the communities are actually there, Elan Pape is very thorough in his research, and he reveals in the Israeli archives Plan Dalet, Plan D in English. Plan D is literally the strategic document. It's called Plan D for a reason, because there were 3 previous plans before Plan D. But Plan D is the one the Zionist movement settles on in Israel, in the Mandate of Palestine, in the 1920s. In the 1920s, this document is settled on as the strategic goal of the Zionist movement, and the goal of Plan D is to expel the Palestinians by force from the Palestinian territories. So maybe in 1913, Herzl wasn't thinking this, but everyone in Palestine in the 1920s in the Zionist movement was thinking of forced removal of the local population. He's not going to mention it though, so we'll continue.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay. Speaking of which, Herzl's unsent correspondences with Rhodes does not provide evidence of colonization in the latter sense of the term. The invocation of Rhodes in these discussions seems to function a little more than an attempt at establishing guilt by association. Nowhere in Herzl's drafted correspondences is there any talk of establishing an operation aimed at extracting wealth from the land, as Rhodes has done with the diamond fields of South Africa. Upon closer inspection, it becomes evident that the use of the term colony and its derivatives in Herzl's written works, correspondences with Rhodes, and organizations like the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association does not provide evidence of plans to exploit or subjugate the Arabs of Palestine. Neither does the fact that Zionists tried to work with the mandate system from 1920 onwards to facilitate their project. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British Empire declares its intention to establish a national homeland for the Jewish people, does not reflect any desire on the part of Jews to economically exploit Palestine to reach some distant motherland. No, because
yeah, what does a national homeland for the Jewish people in that situation? What do you do with the Palestinians?
Well, as you said, you expel them. So again, he's being so disingenuous. It's like, yes, the goal wasn't to exploit them, the goal was to expel them.
Or kill them if they resisted. That was the other plan as well.
Which also happened.
Right. The fact that Great Britain intended this for itself is immaterial to the accusation being directed at Israel. In any complex act of statecraft, many people with different motivations will be involved, and people out of power, like persecuted Jews fleeing Europe, will be forced to do business with whoever happens to be in power. Well, I contest that Britain wanted to exploit the region. What they more wanted to do was, okay, they wanted access to the oil for the Royal Navy, but also, as we've discussed, Hunger, there are certain intellectuals and colonial officials who wanted to indulge the fantasy such as pan-Arabism and testing out these grand sort of national constructions and seeing what would happen as a result of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, it was about controlling more land from France and Sykes-Picot as well. That was an earlier part of the division of the Middle East. And France and Britain squabbled over Palestine originally, but the British won over on that front.
It was also about securing the route to India.
Yeah, and the Suez Canal as well.
Yes, but that's what I mean. So strategic control, but why they wanted to achieve that by having a network of independent, one either great independent Arab state or a federation of Arab states which would be loyal to Britain. That's my point. They didn't want to rule it as a colony that was only a short-term measure.
No, exactly. That the purpose of the mandate was to eventually pass on independence. But the British got themselves in an unbearable situation where they had to give the Arabs independence and the Jews a national homeland, which is completely mutually exclusive and didn't work out, which is why they abandoned the entire project. That's why they had a mandate system. That's why it was not a colony.
Exactly. From 1882 to 1920, the Zionists did business with the Ottoman Empire. It doesn't follow from this that Zionism was therefore an imperial enterprise. Okay, now we're using the term imperial and not colonial. Okay, similarly, the presence of Brits in Palestine who wanted Jews to leave Europe out of feelings of anti-Semitism, or who wanted Jews to establish their state out of apocalyptic theological convictions, does not imply that the Zionist project was predicated upon the hatred of Jews or the desire for Jesus to return. And likewise, the presence of Brits who imposed a colonial enterprise over the land does not imply that the people who were forced to do business with them, including both Jews and Arabs, were themselves engaging in colonialism. The role of eviction and radicalization, none of this should be taken to imply that the Jews acted like saints, as Herzl himself wrote in his diary. We must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries. While denying it employment in our own country, the property owners will come over to our side, but the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. The way it went down was like this. Zionist organizations would coordinate the financial, logistical, and political resources necessary to remove Jews from Europe to Palestine. Funding was procured through philanthropic and lobbying efforts with various government agencies, and upon arrival, newly immigrated Jews would be providing training and housing to help build the country.
The Rothschilds.
Indeed. Land for business and farms was purchased either directly from the landowners or indirectly from the empire in charge if there were no private owners. Exact figures are difficult to come by, but according to the Peel Commission in 1937, the shortage of land is due less to purchase by Jews than to the increase in the Arab population. The Arabs claim that the Jews have obtained too large a proportion of good land cannot be maintained. Much of the land now carrying orange groves was sand dunes or swamps and uncultivated when it was brought. The shortage of land is, we consider, due less to the amount of land acquired by Jews than the increase in the Arab population. Of the land that had been peopled, the majority of tenants were subsequently evicted. There were exactly 0 cases of land being forcibly seized from the original Arab landlords. Most of this business took place from 1901 to 1925, with the Sursok purchases, which, according to a 1946 memorandum published by the Arab Higher Committee, accounted for around 60% of the subset of land purchases in which prior tenants were evicted. According to the Shaw Commission, the purchase reflected an eviction of around 1,800 families. It's interesting he mentioned Sursok purchases because, if I recall, Hunger, aren't they a Lebanese like elite family, the Sursoks?
Yes, they are.
Oh, it's interesting that they're involved in this. Did they do on like a lot of real estate?
They own land in Palestine. They were just an elite family. They have a very famous house in Beirut. It's a museum now. But going back to this argument, how much land did the Jews owe in the territory of Palestine? Because that is very important to the context of who was evicted and what was purchased. But please continue the passage.
Okay. The total number of Arabs evicted from Zionist land purchases can be estimated after granting generous assumptions that inflate the true figure, rounding the number of families evicted in the Sursot purchases up to 2,000 and estimating an average of 10 family members per household, we arrive at a figure of 20,000 evictees. Double that to account for the remaining 40% not accounted for by the specific set of purchases, and you get a total figure of no more than 40,000. Arab Palestinians who were evicted due to Zionist land purchases. This accounts for 3% of the Arab population in Palestine in 1946.
And this is because the Jews bought 6% of the land. If they had bought 60% of the land, that would be a different story. And the eviction would be in the hundreds of thousands.
Again, it's sins of omission rearing their ugly head again in this article. I don't deny unpleasantness of forced eviction, especially in cases where evictees had been tied to the land for multiple generations. But I do deny that accumulated over 3% of the population and over the course of 60 years, this constitutes such a serious breach of the social contract as to warrant the immense violence that the Palestinian Arabs unleashed upon the Jews from 1920 onwards. I mean, was there a social contract between the Palestinian Arabs and the Jews? It's interesting he uses that expression.
Yes, it's almost like they're one polity.
Well, you've not been making that out for most of this article, my son.
I assume the Palestinians didn't exist.
I'll have much more to say on this subject in the next section. But beginning in 1920, the Arabs of Palestine enacted escalating acts of mass rape and murder. This culminated in a pogrom in the city of Hebron, which ultimately resulted in the ethnic cleansing of its Jewish population, a population consisting principally of families that had resided there for 8 centuries. These escalating acts of violence, which continued into the 30s through the Arab revolts, had the effect of increasingly radicalizing the Jewish population. Contrary to Cooper's suggestion that it had been the Zionist firebrand Vladimir Jabotinsky who had radicalized the Jews, every indication is that it was the violence of the Arabs themselves that led to the increasing militancy of the Zionists.
Vladimir Jabotinsky literally radicalized the Jews. Like, this is just undeniable. That's one point. Second point, it's almost like the actions of Ashkenazi Jews led to blowback against the local Mizrahi Jews in Palestine from Jewish actions.
No, exactly.
Also, Zionism is a radical ideology. It is not a moderate ideology. So I love this idea where he says, oh, they became radicalized. No, they already came radicalized. That's why they were already forming terrorist organizations to get rid of the local population.
I mean, what about this whole narrative of, being the oppressed people for 2,000 years, suffering under all these various overlords and empires? I mean, you certainly gave the impression that they've been radicalized by that experience, but now you're denying it, and it only just happened in 1920, which is it?
I think we know the answer to that. If King Crocoduck if he is the standard by which the Jews thought of themselves in the 1910s and 20s, then I'm not surprised.
No, and okay. The most moderate of self-defense organizations formed by Zionists in response to the escalating violence of Arab Palestinians, the Haganah, was formed in 1920 after the Nebi Musa riots, of which more would be said later. This force consisted mainly of untrained Jewish farmers who took turns defending their settlements, but became more centralized and professional in response to the ethnic cleansing of Hebron in 1929. I like the fact he uses the term ethnic cleansing, so it wasn't just like a race riot. No, it was actual deliberate ethnic cleansing.
Let's not mention the fact that pre-1929, pre this pogrom in Hebron, Plan Dalet had already been formed. Plan D had already been formed, and Herzl and the Jewish Council, or I can't remember the exact name, had already decided on expelling the Palestinians. But let's not mention that was pre-1929.
No. In 1931, a paramilitary organization called the Irgun was created. It was rooted in the more radical ideology expressed by Jabotinsky, which vacillated between endorsements for colonialism, by which I mean the actual kind, and appeals to a more liberal solutions to Zionist problems. The attitude he endorsed varied largely as a function of his mood at the time of writing. It will come as little surprise that Palestinian historiographers love to quote the things that Jabotinsky wrote in his more fiery moods as evidence that Zionism was an inherently aggressive enterprise. Cooper himself quotes Jabotinsky extensively in his podcast in support of this thesis, but it is important to remember that Jabotinsky's ideology was accepted by only about 1% of Zionists when he first came onto the scene and never entered the double digits until after the Palestinian Arabs had ethnically cleansed Hebron. Regardless, it never enjoyed anything close to majority support from Zionists. The overwhelming majority adhered to a more moderate variant of the ideology. To Cooper's credit, he does at some point acknowledge that Jabotinsky was much less extreme and much more liberal than his opponents give him credit for, but were never presented any evidence to support this. We are only ever treated quotes about his expansionist and colonial dreams, never quotes like the following: I never said that Zionists ought to expel Arabs from Palestine or anything that could be interpreted in this sense. My position is, on the contrary, that no one will expel from the land of Israel its Arab inhabitants, either all or a portion of them. This is first of all immoral and secondly impossible.
I literally do not believe he means what he's saying. I literally do not believe this.
What, Crocodile or Jabotinsky?
Jabotinsky. I believe he said it. I did not. I do not for a second believe he actually believed it.
No, I think that's fair. Even radical Jabotinsky had maintained repeatedly that Arabs living inside of the Jewish state ought to be granted equal rights under the law, and this remained his position, as well as nearly everyone else's, about the episodes of violence and mass murder that repeatedly plagued Jews in mandatory Palestine. True enough, the Zionists had increasingly developed an appetite for Arab expulsion at the Yishuv, the Jewish community in the land of Israel, was treated pogrom after pogrom, but never became an officially endorsed feature of state policy. There will be much more to say about the mechanics of the Nakba later on in this essay, but suffice it to say that the mass expulsion of Arabs from Palestine was ultimately carried out not as a matter of express Zionist principle, but as an inconsistently applied military directive during a defensive war, and almost exclusively in response to evolving situations on the ground.
This is pure propaganda. This is just... I don't even know where to start. This is just complete propaganda.
I mean, we can almost make the argument that this whole article's been propaganda. So.
Also, I love how he just says early in the paragraph, oh, Jakubensky and his radical Zionist, let's ethnically cleanse them, were 1%. No. They were probably the majority, if not the outright majority or plurality, of the Jewish colonists coming to Palestine had that ideology. As Hungary even mentioned, they had Plan D well before 1929. So, no, they were not moderates, and they were not a tiny, tiny part of the Jewish settlers. They were probably the majority, if not a plurality of them. So I just had to nitpick with that 1% number that he just pulled out of nowhere.
And I mean, it's interesting. Finally, admits that in Zionism, there's moderate and extreme Zionists. Yes, the moderate it's they both want genocide. Just the moderates want it slowly.
So it's better.
It doesn't matter what the local majority of Jews believed. The Jewish Agency had decided by the mid-1920s that they wanted to expel the Palestinians. That is just a stone cold fact that the Jewish Agency had already drafted Plan D, even if the majority of the people did not agree with it, for moral reasons. This is just a fact.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Returning to the subject at hand, the true radicals of the Zionist movement emerged in the 1940 with the formation of the terrorist organization Lehi. It was a deeply unpopular group that attempted to form an alliance with Nazi Germany. To give some context for that, that's a reference to Abraham Sturm, who was the founder of Lehi, sent one letter to the German consul in Ankara in 1940 asking for support, and he never got a response. So that was the extent to which there was an attempt at a Zionist-Nazi alliance. So, but obviously Crocodile wants you to read more into that. So it was roundly condemned by nearly all the Jews in mandatory Palestine and never numbered greater than 1,000. More will be said about their role in the conflict in the next section. For now, let us close with a summary of this fourth and most crucial of assumptions advanced by Palestinian historiography. By casting Zionists and colonizers and the Arabs of Palestine as colonized, Cooper dutifully recites the framework that sanitizes Palestinian violence against the Jews as a form of understandable, if not necessarily justifiable, resistance. The characterization of Zionism as a colonial enterprise fails to hold up scrutiny when the actual definitions and historical practices of colonialism are considered. Unlike colonists of the sort alluded to by those who charge Zionism with this term, the Jews did not arrive in Palestine to exploit its resources and send back wealth to a distant motherland. Instead, they invested in developing the land they viewed as their ancestral home. Practices of economic exploitation and forced displacement that are central to actual colonial endeavours are not reflected in the actions of Zionist settlers who purchased land and sought to integrate, albeit contentiously, into the region. Furthermore, the assertion that Zionism was merely a form of European colonialism overlooks the complex religious and national dynamics at play, revealing a deeper conflict rooted in identity and sovereignty, rather than simple colonial ambition. Upon scrutinizing the terms in historical context, it becomes clear that the shoe of colonialism will not fit the foot of Zionism, no matter how much twisting of the original definition and cherry-picking of non-representative quotes one engages in. Well, it doesn't fit because it's the wrong definition.
The only person twisting definitions is King Crocoduck.
Also, it's just patently untrue. Even in the modern state of Israel, they love exploiting the local like slave, Palestinian populations. I mean, I saw this video on YouTube one time where this Jewish settler in the West Bank was literally talking about how they can like treat the Palestinians as basically slaves and like how great it is. So I don't think that's in conflict with Zionism at all, even if it wasn't originally part of the original agenda. It very much is still there and is still in play right now. So he's just patently wrong in that paragraph right there.
It's like when it comes to the Jews, we have to accept the long arc of history and all the different events and happenstances that the Jews have gone through to understand what they are like in the present. But oh no, we can't do that for Palestinians. No, they've never had an identity. They don't have a history. They're just a blank, voidless people.
Yeah, they have no culture before the Jews arrived, according to him.
Okay, well, Hunger has to go very shortly, so I think we'll wrap this up here. And so, yeah, it looks like we'll be doing a third part of this. So, is there any final comments you two want to make before we get out of here?
No. Oh well, just finally, this is just like this is a very hard Substack to get through. Not just because the arguments are extremely sloppy. It's just personally, I find this. How do I say it? I find this personally objectionable on many levels because it just denies. It denies facts that Zionists themselves, if you ask them, will just flat out admit. But King Crocoduck has to do this little dance around the actual issues. Like Jabotinsky literally saying in other quotes, like, yes, we literally have to get rid of these people. Otherwise, we can't have a Jewish state because we have to be the majority. He doesn't quote that quote from Jabotinsky, but apparently that's not relevant to the circumstances.
I think I would just close it out with saying that they never change, and the fact that he keeps bringing up taxation is just, I find that funny. I think he brought it up a couple paragraphs ago. We talked about the Romans taxing them as this grand conspiracy to humiliate them. Once again, we just see the way these people think. and it never really changes. So, and that's why this article keeps going on and on. That's all I really have to say about it.
Right. Okay. So in terms of this channel, I'm not sure when we'll pick this up. Might be next week. If not, we'll pick it up at some point in the future. Is there anything you would like to show, Hunger?
Just follow me at Twitter at HungerDye, DYE. And the two things I want to show is our stream from Saturday, our latest Chatham House version stream. It was really good conversation. And yeah, I'm sorry to say we were stream sniping AM and Semiagog. You know, I know millions of people were watching us and not watching Apostolic Majesty and Semiagog. So please, after this is done, please check out that stream as well.
Yes, and from a comment in the chat, I think it sounds like AM might have sent some people our way, so I'm very thankful for that. And is there
Fantastic.
anything you would like to show, AE?
Yes, if you guys would like to check out my channel, just American Elitist on YouTube, I think I have some good stuff on there that you guys might be interested. So just check that out if you're interested. That's all I really have to show right now.
Okay, well, thank you all for watching, and good night.